ladies and gentlemen, and good morning to those who are not from within Australia, and good evening to those who are also not from within Australia. I believe we have more than 400 delegates, potentially from a number of different countries. I'm delighted that you could all join us for the launch of what I would say one of the most outstanding outcomes of CRC care. With me today is Dr. Paul Vogel, who is chair of CRC Care Board of Directors. I have also the chair of Heads of EPA and chair of EPA Victoria, Ms. Cheryl Barrie, Dr. Bruce Kennedy, who is the leader of the program that delivered this major outcome, Dr. Mark Berman from Defence, speaking about the implications of National Remediation Framework to Defence. Mr. Gavin Price, who is also going to speak about the implications of National Remediation Framework to BHP and minerals industry. And indeed also Mr. Ross McFarlane, who was the chair of the National Remediation Framework committee that led to the delivery of this major milestone. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Paul Vogel, AM. Dr. Vogel was the chair, founding chair, and also chief executive of South Australian EPA, and he was the one who really got South Australian EPA to where it is today. And then, having spent 5 years with South Australian EPA, he was invited by Western Australian government to take over the role of chair of EPA Western Australia. And when he retired from that position, he was invited by the Minister of Environment, Northern Territory government, to take over the role of chair of Northern Territory EPA. And you can see why CRC Care and myself, we are so delighted to have Dr. Paul Vogel, AM, as the chair of CRC Care's Board of Directors. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Paul Vogel, who is going to take us through the introduction to the launch of National Remediation Framework. Thank you very much. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Ravi, for those kind words. Look, it is indeed a great pleasure to welcome delegates to the launch of the National Remediation Framework. Australia has long been at the forefront of actively pursuing protection of the environment, and the subject of today's webinar is no exception. Given my current role as chair of the Northern Territory EPA and having previously led the SA and WA EPAs, I recognise the importance of state leadership and territory leadership in the development of national environment protection measures, or NEPMs, including the assessment of site contamination NEPM. Some of us have been around long enough to have been involved in the development of the National Environment Protection Measure for assessment of site contamination, colloquially known as the ASC NEPM. Since it came into effect in 1999, the NEPM provided a comprehensive and rigorous process for assessing contamination, but there remained a significant gap at a national level to a harmonised approach for remediation. A nationally consistent approach to remediation has for many years been a highly sought after goal, especially for industry. With the legislation on remediation varying between states and territories, CRC Care, along with state, territory and Commonwealth regulators, recognise a challenge confronting practitioners and, importantly, end users that had operations across Australia. In response, and after widespread consultation, the CRC proposed a National Remediation Framework and invested resources and considerable time towards its development. Designed to complement the NEPM, the NRF provides a nationally harmonised approach for the remediation and management of contaminated sites across Australia. In November 2019, the NRF was endorsed as best practice by all jurisdictions through the Heads of EPA Forum. The National Remediation Framework is wholeheartedly supported in Australia and has also attracted strong international interest. Remediation projects can often be quite dissimilar, each with their own specific issues and needs. The NRF is unique in its valuable guidance for planning and implementing a wide range of remediation approaches through all stages of the process, regardless of the particular characteristics of any individual site. The NRF will be of great benefit to practitioners involved in cleaning up and managing contaminated sites, as well as to regulators, and has been many years in the making. Importantly, it has the support of all stakeholders, having been developed in cooperation with contaminated site practitioners, as well as regulators and owners of contaminated sites. Finally, I'd like to commend Bruce Kennedy, former Executive Policy Advisor and Program Leader at CRC Care, as well as Professor Ravi Naidu, for their efforts in getting to NRF started and making sure it came to fruition. It is without doubt one of the most significant accomplishments of CRC Care. On that final note, I would like to introduce to you all Dr. Bruce Kennedy to take us through his presentation. Bruce, over to you.
Thanks, Paul. Okay, well, I'll do exactly that, and I'll actually run through a PowerPoint outlining the genesis and contents of the NRF, and then we'll pass over to Ross McFarlane, the chair of the National Remediation Framework Steering Group. Basically, as Paul and Ravi have indicated, the NRF basically delineates harmonisation and common ground for remediation management, con sites within Australia. And as you're aware, I mean, Australia is a federation, and there is a division of powers between the Commonwealth or the federal government and the states. And under the Constitution, environmental protection and land management happen to be a state responsibility. And naturally enough, each state has their own approach, although there are great similarities when you're dealing with similar problems. But nonetheless, it means that states are able to develop approaches to meet their own needs. Having said that, I think all states and the federal government recognise the benefits of national harmonisation, and when it comes to remediation, the idea of getting consistency across jurisdictions, particularly for companies that operate across state boundaries, the need to improve standards of practice over time for the public and the wider public and governments and community, and improve certainty and confidence in remediation outcomes, I think, is particularly important. And also the concept of a common remediation language from one state to another. And very important, I think, for all of us as a community, and particularly for companies that operate nationally, cost efficiencies should result from common approaches rather than having to have separate approaches or different approaches from one state to another. So cost efficiencies, I think, are particularly important. And also it should actually promote the portability of best practice from one state to another. So something that's working well in one state can be taken up very quickly in other states. And also workforce implications, the mutual recognition of skills across Australia. That already happens to a fair degree with auditors. Now, it's important to recognise, as Paul said, that we already have a harmonised national approach when it comes to the assessment of site contamination through the NEPM. And as Paul indicated, there's a big gap when it came to remediation and management. One of the early suggestions was that we actually extend the NEPM or create a new NEPM. That's legally not possible because NEPMs are developed under legislation. Legislation doesn't allow for that. So the other option was the concept of a national remediation framework, which would complement the NEPM, and at the suggestion of regulators, CRC Care undertook to develop the NRF. So in terms of the purpose of the NRF, provide a national consistent approach, as you'd expect from what I've just said. Its principal audiences are practitioners and regulators. The expected outcomes are facilitation of human health and environment, protection thereof, as you'd expect, efficient and effective remediation, as I've indicated already, net community benefit when it comes to environmental issues, human health issues, economic issues and social issues, and all, as I've indicated previously, the transfer of best practice and mutual recognition. The NRF really is a practical approach to issues. We weren't trying to necessarily reinvent the wheel, because there's a lot of very good expertise and very good regulation out there at the moment. So it's a matter of taking a practical approach where the guidance involved would indicate how to do something, when to do it, in keeping with all the other guidance that CRC Care produces. The idea was that the NRF would be constructed on a modular basis, which would provide flexibility, wherein individual elements can be updated as is necessary. I might add that there are 12 modules, many of which comprise one guideline, but several involve several guidelines. Also, too, another element of flexibility is the fact that the NRF is not a legal instrument, and therefore, unlike the NEPM, to update the NEPM is difficult from a legal perspective. That's not the case with the NRF, so there's a fair bit of flexibility there. Compatibility, it needs to be compatible with the principles agreed by the steering group, and we'll talk about those shortly. It needs to be compatible with the NEPM for pretty obvious reasons. I mean, the consultant is doing the assessment of contamination on the site. It makes sense that you work in a seamless manner into getting into the remediation perspectives. And of course, very important from the perspective of jurisdictions, it does not in any way limit or impinge on their decision-making prerogatives. It builds on current guidance and practice. And we all know, of course, that practice and guidance, or practice moves on, and I'll talk about that shortly. In the development of the NRF, it was oversighted by a steering group, most recently chaired by Ross McFarland, who'll be talking shortly. And the role of the group was to provide strategic direction and oversight for the development, to ensure that everything was complete and it was technically robust. The steering group comprised site owners, particularly defence, mining, and the petroleum industry. The industry people actually involved in cleanup, consultants and auditors. So you can see immediately there's a huge amount of expertise in the group. The governments who are involved because of regulatory requirements, the community representative, and the construction industry, which of course has to do with contaminated sites as well. In terms of the content of the NRF, this is a kind of a schematic which was developed to actually initially to guide the development and planning of the construction of the NRF. The principles, which I briefly referred to before, include precautionary principle, prevention, sustainability, options hierarchy, polluter pays. Now, I think you would all immediately see that there's a remarkable similarity with the principles agreed by the Intergovernmental Agreement on the Environment back in 1992. And that, of course, is quite deliberate. The meat of the NRF is the guidance, and the guidance is divided up into 3 areas: the development of a remediation action plan, its implementation, and then, of course, post-remediation considerations. When it comes to the RAP development area, regulatory considerations, of course, are paramount. And so, it's the old story, when a particular company wishes to begin a remediation project, the first thing you should do is go and talk to the regulator as to what you can and can't do. Remediation objectives are a particularly important guideline in terms of being able to set the objectives for the remediation. This will drive not only techniques, technologies, timelines and cost, as well as ensuring that the objectives are acceptable to the local EPA. So a particularly important guideline. Remediation options assessment, and that follows on from having set the remediation objectives. Technology guidelines, there's about 13 or 14 of those, and that basically is the matrix to assist people in choosing the appropriate technologies for the situation involved. And cost benefit and sustainability analysis, principally for very large projects and or very complex projects. Most of the small, straightforward projects don't require that level of analysis, but the sustainability bit is very important, and it does take on board quite a few of the aspects of the recent ISO standard that came out. So there are linkages between the NRF and ISO. When it comes to implementation, health and safety of on-site is particularly important. Stakeholder engagement, always important. And documentation, record keeping and reporting, that sounds pretty boring, but I mean, as any consultant would know, that's critically important in terms of documenting what's done, how it's done, why it's done. And after the remediation is hopefully complete, how you go about validation and closure. And that, of course, relates back to the remediation objectives guideline. The role of auditing, I'd point out too that this is not a guideline on auditing. It's basically an information paper on what auditors do, and is really for the non-auditing public. Long-term monitoring, it may well be that it's not feasible to clean up every last molecule of contaminant on the site, and there's a need to leave the site still partly contaminated, but with long-term monitoring as agreed with the local regulator and or institutional controls, which use the planning type controls on the land. And all those factors actually feed back into the remediation objectives guideline. And also too, I'd point out that with remediation objectives, it may well be that once you actually start digging up the site, you may find material that wasn't previously suspected, and therefore you might need to actually slightly modify the objectives in terms of what you can achieve. The framework also includes a flow chart. The schematic was a bit static, if you like. The flow chart, and I won't go into the detail here, indicates how you apply the different guidelines in appropriate sequence. In terms of the development of the NRF, as I indicated, there's about 24 guidelines. The initial draft documents were developed by consultants. The steering group considered the draft and provided comments, sometimes very, very, very many comments, to the extent where we had to completely revise what had been provided to us by the consultants. And once everything was done to the satisfaction of the steering group, the draft guidelines were endorsed for release for consultation, which was then done with governments, industry and the public, and comments received. Now, in the last few years, we're actually completed all the guidelines. A complete package was put together. The guidelines were, individual guidelines were refined using the feedback from the consultation on individual guidelines. We ensured that there's common terminology across the guidelines and links between them, as well as ensuring the links with the NEPM, critically important. And many of you may have been involved in the roadshow that we conducted early last year to present the almost final package. We then took further comments, and the whole package has been updated even further as a result of the comments from the roadshow period. I think it's important to recognise that the development process lends credibility to the framework itself. The expertise is basically provided by the consultants, and I also mentioned the high level of expertise on the steering group, stakeholder involvement through the steering group, and those consultations on the draft guidelines, and intersection with governments. All states and territories were on the steering group, so there was that connection with governments and connections with HEPA. And I'm pleased to be able to say, and Cheryl will go into this in more detail, but HEPA, the heads of EPAs, was pleased to endorse the NRF as best practice, and we're very pleased to receive that letter from Cheryl late last year. In terms of the future, there will be a need for reviews. Technology moves on, regulation moves on, and of course, the first time you put guidance out, there are always little things that need to be fixed. So there will be reviews required because of the first time through perspective. Technology moves on, so the technology approaches, sustainability approaches. I've no doubt that ISO will be reviewed sometime in the next few years. And of course, ongoing changes in the regulation, and I think Victoria would be a prime example of that. Website, a dedicated website is being developed through Jyoti and Alan Barclay. It comprises all the guidelines, of course, a flow chart, which I've just shown you, a feedback form, a toolbox of other guidance, which is not part of the NRF, but is related to it, and links to other websites. That's the homepage of the website. There's a feedback form as well, and that's particularly important, and we encourage all users of the NRF to provide feedback where they can see improvements can be made. Acknowledgements. It's been a long process, and Paul referred to that. The actual team, Jyoti, Kerry and myself, Jyoti's done a huge amount of work, and I think it's fair to say that we wouldn't be where we are today except for the work that Jyoti's done over the last several years. Kerry Scott, project manager, a really driving project manager and really ensuring get things got done. In our steering group, as I said, a very important group, and Ross Farland is the most recent chair. Stuart McConnell, the initial chair. Janet Millen also is involved as well. And we thank them for their time. And there are too many members to name, but their names are listed on the website. And the level of support we had through CRC Care and particularly through Ravi for resources was obviously critical to the success of the development. Consultants, GHD, CH2M, Jacobs, Toxicos and Quorum were very critical in developing the guidance. And not to forget all the people, many hundreds of people who provided submissions on the draft guidelines right through the process. And all of that was very welcome. In summary, the NRF provides a harmonised approach for remediation management, provides a structure for thinking through remedial strategies. It provides for a rigorous approach for considering issues. The systematisation of practices, both from site to site, as well as within a state and then across Australia. A sustainable approach for remediation and management, and let's not forget the link with the ISO standard, and of course, critically important, the linkages with the NEPM. And I think it's fair to say that the NRF and the NEPM together provide a comprehensive package of nationally harmonised guidance for assessment, remediation and management of site contamination. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Bruce. And look, it was remiss of me not to introduce properly Dr. Bruce Kennedy, who was former Executive Policy Advisor and Program Leader for CRC Care, who was previously Executive Officer of the National Environment Protection Council and the Environment Protection and Heritage Council, and Executive Director of the NEPC Service Corporation. He was responsible for national policy development for environmental protection matters within the remit of those national councils, including assessment of site contamination. And prior to taking up his role with the NEPC, Service Corporation. He was a manager with the West Australian EPA. So Bruce and I go back a long way.
Indeed.
So now, look, we're getting on to the part of the webinar that involves end user perspectives. And I'd like to introduce to you Ross McFarland. He's AECOM's Chief Environmental Scientist and Industry Director for Australia and New Zealand. And he's also chair of the NRF steering group. He's a certified contaminated land practitioner and a state certified contaminated land site auditor in New South Wales, ACT, NT and WA. He supports AECOM staff in all jurisdictions of Australia, New Zealand and the Pacific. He has more than 40 years of local, national and international environmental chemistry experience focused on risk-based contaminated sites assessment and remediation, especially for former chemical agent sites, as well as more generally for emerging contaminants such as asbestos in soil and PFAS. Please join me in welcoming Ross McFarland.
Thank you very much. My presentation is quite short. I'm sitting in the role of presenting on behalf of the consultants, contractors, certified environmental practitioners and site auditors in terms of how useful or not this national remediation framework is. I must note my vested interest and my conflict of interest in that I was the chair of the committee that put the finishing touches to the document over the last year and a half or so. I wanted to start off by acknowledging, as Dr. Kennedy did, a few important people, and special thanks go to Stuart McConnell, who was the founding chair of the National Remediation Framework Committee and now is General Manager of Place and Communities at East Gippsland Shire Council. I'm not sure whether Stuart was able to dial in today, but I wanted to thank him personally for making the effort of herding all of those cats together early in the piece and bringing an element of harmony between a whole lot of different groups, lots of different interests all coming together. And I think the first few years of this process was quite a challenge, and it's remarkable how Stuart achieved that, a great product that he passed on to me to finalise. So I can take the glory, but Stuart did all the hard work. Wanted to mention Dr. Kennedy, who was also fundamental in getting this document together. So thank you, Bruce. Also to Kerry Scott and Jotty, who are project managers and principal authors. Bruce Kennedy went through a bit more detail the roles of these different people. I wanted to also thank all of those professionals that willingly donated their time over the past 9 years or past decade in getting this document from a lot of ideas into quite a neatly consolidated framework. Now, a quick comparison from a historical perspective. I was involved in the ASC NEPM that Paul Vogel mentioned as well. And it's interesting that when the NEPM, the ASC NEPM was revised in 2013, it ended up being 1,307 pages divided into 22 volumes, and it took 14 years to come together from its 1999 version to its final update. The NRF, by comparison, is about the same size. It's divided into about the same number of volumes, and it includes a really neat, in my view, macro-enabled 21 tab Excel spreadsheet that relates to that sustainability assessment tool. And I really encourage people that are interested in this area to go and have a go at that tool. It's quite scalable. It looks a bit daunting, but once you get into it, it's really good, very valuable. And like the ASC NEPM, it took a decade or so to go from its initial stages in September 2011 when we first met to when it was finally launched, when it is finally launched today. So great outcome. And another comparison, in the early days, the 1999 NEPM fitted onto a floppy disk or 2 floppy disks. in 1999. When we went up to the 2013 NEPM, we became more data hungry and we're into 128 gigabyte SD cards. And now the new NEPM is web-based. It's up on a cloud system and you can get it in any which way you like these days. A very valuable tool, very easy to access, which is really good. I just wanted to provide a couple of comments or conclusions from the practitioner's view. I canvassed a few of my colleagues across the board about this, as I want to do, and generally speaking, the NRF is it's a natural transition from the NEPM framework for assessment into this really neat tool for management remediation. So it's an excellent tool that takes us from the NEPM into actually doing the work. It's really great that it's nationally accepted and it's very helpful in creating a nationally consistent approach for this remediation step across the board, which is great. It's clearly a dynamic tool, as Bruce Kennedy mentioned. It's divided into various segments and they're naturally going to quickly become not obsolete, but they'll certainly become dated fairly quickly. But thankfully, we made a special effort to make it into a modular tool so that it could be relatively straightforward to update and revise, which is great. And obviously, the elephant in the room, I suppose, is that because it is a dynamic document, it still needs a home for it to be looked after, cared, maintained into the future. And I'm sure that will be a topic of conversation later, I hope. So with that, I'd like to say thank you and give you back to Dr. Vogel.
Thanks very much, Ross, for that practitioner perspective. I'd like now to introduce a perspective from Defence, and Dr. Mark Berman is a Director of Contamination Management within the Department of Defence. He's had 25 years contamination management experience and currently oversees programs cleaning up and managing chemical contamination and unexploded ordnance on and off the Defence estate. Mark's chair of the CRC Care Beyond 2020 Committee and is helping the CRC Care define the next steps for the CRC. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks, Paul. Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to be speaking with you, and thank you for the opportunity to present on behalf of the Department of Defence and participate in the launch of the National Remediation Framework. It's a really exciting opportunity. During this National Reconciliation Week, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia, recognise their continuing contribution and ownership of traditional lands and waters, and pay respects to elders both past and present. I also pay respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, men and women who've contributed to the defence of Australia in times of peace and war. The department was a founding participant of CRC Care through the original leadership of our former Assistant Secretary for Environment and Engineering, Mr. Terry Weston, and Defence remains a strong supporter of CRC Care and the NRF. Many people within Defence have contributed to make today's launch possible, and I would like to offer my thanks for their contributions. As you may be aware, Defence manages large land holdings across Australia on behalf of the entire community. This extensive estate requires Defence to work across multiple jurisdictions to ensure sustainable contamination management. Defence has a large property portfolio of over 3 million hectares, which we currently have a range of contamination investigation and remediation projects at approximately half of the bases that we currently operate out of. We see in our projects that the approach to remediation can vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction and across the practitioners who support our work. We are supportive of harmonising remediation guidance and identifying best practice in managing contaminated sites with the objective of establishing a nationally consistent approach. The NRF will go a long way to standardising the products delivered by our consultants and contractors and maximise the return on the Australian community's investment to ensure the ongoing sustainable use of our training areas and bases. A strength of the NRF is that it's been a true collaborative effort across Australia that has harnessed best practice methods from experienced practitioners to benefit the Australian community. We hope that one of the many positive outcomes from these efforts is that it will improve our conversations with communities about contamination management. In parallel to the launch of the NRF, we have already taken the next steps to integrate the best practices it identifies into our policy and guideline documents. We are pleased that South Sea Care have taken us along the NRF journey and will provide us nationally consistent management for our contaminated lands. On behalf of Defence, I would like to congratulate and thank the many contributors and organisations who have sponsored the development of the NRF. Throughout the journey, the leadership shown by Professor Ravi Naidu and his team has been exemplary and continues to deliver outstanding results for us all. We look forward to further collaboration with you all to ensure the implementation of the framework to ensure its benefits are realised by Defence, the Australian community and the environment. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Mark. It's very pleasing to hear how Defence is embedding the NRF into their policy framework. That's excellent. Thank you so much. The mining perspective now will be given by Gavin Price. Gavin and I know each other very well, go back a long time. Gav's the Head of Environment Analysis and Improvement, Health, Safety and Environment with BHP Minerals Australia. He's worked across the minerals and processing industry sectors for nearly 30 years in the fields of environment, health and safety, external affairs and sustainable development. And welcome, Gavin. Look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Paul, and also to Ravi for providing me the chance to say a few words on this significant occasion. And good day to all on the webinar. I'll be brief, as I guess our mining industry sees the benefits of having a national remediation framework similar to speakers before me, and especially, you know, hearing Dr. Berman with the defence and user perspective. But it's not very often you get the chance to become part of the steering group that brings together regulators, consultants, defence, mining, and other industry representatives together from around Australia to work on a common framework aimed at, as one thing, improving environmental outcomes, but also efficiency of process used in achieving those outcomes. And I guess this is one of the unique abilities of a cooperative research centre, to bring all the parties together on neutral terms to arrive at better outcomes. And BHP has been a participant of CRC Care for about 10 years now. And in that time, we've enjoyed the opportunity to share our own complex problems with the broader research community and regulators in finding smarter solutions to contaminated site remediation. So that all makes sense, saving money while delivering better environment and social outcomes. So when I was asked to contribute to the development of a national remediation framework and represent our mining industry, it was really easy to say yes. What I didn't realise at the time back then was it would take so long, but seeing the enduring team commitment to arrive at an end goal was certainly, you know, well worth it. So what does the national remediation framework mean for our industry? Greater consistency in approach to regulation. So put simply, many of our companies operate across multiple jurisdictions, and a known regulatory environment, either within or across jurisdictions, makes it easier to get things done. Flexibility, so being guidance sitting outside of a regulatory construct means it can be readily adapted with learnings. And while this hasn't been the case historically, this opportunity presents. But if we get this right, it will help speed up shared learnings and improve performance across industry, which for industry can generate time, cost, and reputational benefits. And there lies the challenge from here. Common language. So standardised terms help to ensure consistency in application and administration. So whether it be assessment, remediation, or relinquishment, all those things, legal challenge is always a possibility with contaminated sites remediation projects. And having standardised language, process and practice will help to lead to a more robust outcome and improve due diligence for industry and end users. A ready resource. It's an easy to access one-stop shop for our technical professionals. So having a healthy reference to technical publications and guidance for contamination remediation should help us as an industry to be more effective in assessing our own situation, whether for accounting or remediation purposes. And Dr. McFarlane, he explained earlier the benefits for consultants, and it's our subject matter experts that the mining industry often call on to help with difficult remediation solutions. It can only be a good thing if we can employ a standardised decision-making framework for these complex situations. And for our industry, this means greater certainty of outcome. And then finally, the application of the National Remediation Framework helps our industry to align and gain support of regulators. And we can further improve the confidence of our communities in the process through having this support and a more collaborative approach with a common framework on the remediation solutions we adopt. So in closing, I'd just say that the National Remediation Framework does provide us all with a common position, which it's difficult to bring those sort of positions together, hence the long lead time, to collectively move forward on the unknown challenges ahead, and without would be a missed opportunity. So thank you, and I'll hand back to the chair, Paul.
Thanks very much, Gavin. Very insightful comments. Thank you for that, and also your involvement with the development of the NRF. It's my great pleasure to introduce Cheryl Barrie, PSM, who's the current chair of EPA Victoria and also the current chair of the heads of EPA. She became EPA Victoria chairperson in 2009 and has more than 40 years experience in the waste management, water and environmental sectors. Her prior experience includes chair of Melbourne Water, board member of City West Water and Southern Rural Water, chair of EcoCycle Victoria, deputy chair and board member of Sustainability Victoria, member of the Victorian Catchment Management Council and the Victorian Sustainability Fund Advisory Panel, and she's also chair of the CRC for Water Sensitive Cities. She's got no time to do anything left at all, I don't think. Cheryl, you've been incredibly busy in this field for many, many years, and it's a great pleasure to invite you to launch the NRF.
Thank you, Paul. And thank you, Ravi and team, for the opportunity to launch. And what I would say to you is that to participants, you've heard from the team that developed the NRF, and you've heard from the practitioners, and you've heard from industry. And of course, I am the chair of EPA Victoria and the chair of the heads of EPA Australia and New Zealand, at least until the 30th of June, when I leave both of those roles. So from the regulatory perspective, this is an incredibly important document. I also want to acknowledge not just the time it takes to get a document like this up, but the amount of behind the scenes hours it takes to write it, to get it ready, to draft after draft, and the team that has done that has done an extraordinary job. And I acknowledge not only the time that it's taken, but the quality of the production. It is an incredibly mammoth effort. And why? Because the views of all stakeholders have been taken into account during its development. The NRF Steering Committee itself actually comprised about 50 members, representing researchers, government, including all jurisdictions across Australia, regulators such as my own Victorian EPA, industry, consultants, site owners, and communities as well. Many of us are in the job of creating public good, and this is an extraordinary public good article. The framework itself comprises 24 guidelines, 13 technology guidelines. The guidelines are underpinned by the principles that will ensure Australia's remediation efforts into the future meet a high benchmark on a global scale. It offers incredible value to a wide range of end users spanning regulators, industry and practitioners, and we will all use it. It's designed to be readily updated to ensure it remains best practice into the future. It's freely available via an independent, easy to navigate website, and I've looked at that myself. And it is sorely needed by all of us across Australia. CRC Care, including Ravi and Bruce, deserve an enormous amount of credit and our thanks for bringing these groups together and forging this incredible article. The NRF is a significant step forward in Australia's efforts to address the gap between the approaches around assessing versus remediating contaminated sites. And although it's not legally binding, it complements the NEPM as has been discussed. And I'm certain it'll make a substantial, tangible difference to the way we remediate sites and to outcomes, after all, for communities. I was very pleased to sign the letter indicating that the whole of the heads of EPA supported the NRF last year. And so thus it is with great pleasure that I formally launch the National Remediation Framework. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Cheryl. And you know, I certainly wholeheartedly support you in your words there. It's been a long journey. And it's been my experience that the development of these complex environmental management frameworks do generally take about 7 to 10 years. So that seems to be almost the model time for these complex things. But hopefully in the future we can shorten those things. But this was a national framework, and of course it needs to be thoroughly consulted. So thank you for launching the framework. It's now my great pleasure also to moderate the next question and answer session, and I think Prashant has indicated that there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen where you can ask questions, and hopefully you will also ask who you'd like that question answered by. So if you could do that, you can also, and we have a question already from a gentleman. I don't know if I should be mentioning names, but I won't, so in case they are. But the question is and a very good question, I might add, and one we were talking about before, who will maintain the NRF, whether or not CRC Care is successful in its rebid? And I think there's either an opportunity to answer live or type an answer. I think it would be good if we could have a live answer. So I guess I might ask for some different perspective. I think Ross raised the point, it's an important asset, but maybe Cheryl, did you have a view about that at all?
Well, look, depending on CRC Care's future, that is one possibility. But clearly, a document like this will need to be updated as things change, and things change very quickly. So the other possibility is that groups like the heads of EPA, it falls into the ownership, the collective ownership across the jurisdictions. We've got no agreement around that, and I think a lot depends on the future of CRC Care. But I think there is commitment, I know there is commitment across jurisdictions to ensure that this work is regularly updated and maintained. You don't start this work again. We need to continue it. And the issues around remediation, the technologies around remediation are emerging every single day. And so that it does need to be maintained. I think the participant has asked an incredibly good question. We just don't have a certain answer, but I know the value to which it's held by all of the regulators across Australia. And I would expect that if CRC Care does not continue, that there would have to be some arrangement between us all. We do have, through heads of EPA, guidelines, national guidelines that we have produced ourselves, and that's the same. I see there is a natural home for it if that's the case.
Thanks, Cheryl. No, very, very good question. And, you know, one, the heads of EPA will have to turn its mind to, and I think Cheryl's answered it very comprehensively. So thank you for that Cheryl, are there any other questions that people wish to? There's none there at the moment, but we'll wait until perhaps there is. But are there any other comments in relation to the maintenance of this national asset? Are there any other observations that any of the practitioners wish to make? I know Ross has already made a statement, but Mark, yeah, please.
Well, I think I could add from perhaps a defence perspective that I think the upkeep and continued development of the NRF is probably what's important, and that the benefit of having cross-industry involvement is really what's one of the strengths of the current approach. So whatever the format it takes, having that ability to have both the practitioners, industry and end users and regulators involved in that continued development is probably what's critical, regardless of what the actual formal mechanism might be. So yeah. A lot of commitment to continue the work, and that the format perhaps is less important than continuing that journey.
Yep. Thanks so much, Mark. Anybody else? Gavin, did you want to make any observations about that matter?
Paul, I think Mark probably hit on it from our perspective. It's more the effectiveness in use. It's no good having something that sits on a shelf. And the world's changing, it's getting faster. So we've got to set dynamic processes up, have agile mechanisms, and it's probably about the construct of how we connect and then engage progressively rather than, often this will standardise, but the world will move fast.
Yep. Thanks for that, Gavin. Look, we've got some other questions coming in now, so I'm going to read these. This is one from Amanda, who's asking, have we had any sites that have used the NRF yet? And what was their experience? I'm going to hand over to whoever on the panel would feel like they're competent to answer that question. Does anybody know if the NRF's been used anywhere? What was their experience?
It's Ross here, and in my role as site auditor, I've directed people, consultants and contractors to the various guidance documents to suggest that they follow those as a benchmark, a fundamental tool. And that's been really handy. Also, the institutional controls guidance document has been really good as a fundamental tool in the development of long-term management plans. And the long-term management plan guidelines has also been a really good benchmark tool. So there's been a gap of information in our industry about how to deal with these things. There's been some fragmented information across the jurisdictions generally, but having one place for an auditor to be able to point to and ask consultants to work up from there has been really, really useful. So that's been in place since the draft guidance came out towards the end of last year. So it's been quite good in that respect, Paul.
Thanks, Ross. Any other observations from any of the other panelists on that? No? Okay. Let's go to the next question. How regularly do the panels see the NRF being refreshed or revised? That is, progression in remediation technologies with emerging contaminants, etc. Sort of goes a bit to the heart of the issue around maintenance before, but how regularly do the panels see it being refreshed? Anybody can step forward and ask that one, answer that one. I guess it's something that CRC Care, should it be successful in its next life, but it's also something that the heads of EPA, one would imagine, would have to address as well, and be alert to changes in technology, alert to changes in regulation and practice, so that it can be nimble and adapt those documents. So again, I think it's probably part of the discussion that heads of EPA will need to have, and depending on what happens with CRC Care. That was my observation anyway. But it is an absolutely necessary thing to do, otherwise it will like any environmental asset, if not maintained, it will degrade in value, and that is not what we want to see. We want to see it being refreshed and recalibrated over time as things change, which they inevitably will. Next question. Sorry.
So Paul, just add a more practical angle on that, because it's a really good question. Because this is where probably we don't always get it right in process. You know, we go through a huge effort, and then we think the job's done, and thereafter something gets used, but you know, over time it becomes stale, and people move on. I think the challenge for this is how, and the beauty of having it outside the regulatory, you know, the construct, you know, sitting as guidance, sets it up well for going forward and adapting as we go. It's probably it probably needs some sort of frequent review mechanism which sits in time as an underlying principle, but thereafter it's on an as needs basis. So there will be areas or particular guidance elements that will move faster than others that will probably need review sooner. And I think it's having the mechanism or the body that can monitor and take end users' perspectives back in, and then be agile around what gets changed when. So I think that's the difference between an effective system that we build for tomorrow versus, you know, just putting in play, you know, a standard and then sitting back and letting it go. But I think that's the challenge, I think, of whoever picks it up, the body who has it, is how to do that.
Yeah, good comment. Thanks.
Paul, if I may, right. Absolutely agree with Gavin and the rest of the team as well. And every policy that we have, that's usually underpinned by sound science. And for Australia, the science that we have is pretty unique because we are looking at strongly weathered soils that are very different the way they behave. And therefore, any legislation that we have, we always start with precautionary approach and then underpin that with science, which leads to regulations or policies. And therefore, NRF, for instance, going forward, is the science that's going to help us drive it forward. And therefore, it'll be continuously we will have to monitor that and see what new science is there and see how that helps us further revise, review, and update NRF. So that's where science within Australia is quite important, and I'm hoping that in some form CRC care will continue.
Thank you, Ravi. We've got another question from Jamie, which is, what is the scale and scope of projects the NRF will cover? So I want to answer that question. Ross.
Or maybe Jyoti as well. I can say that it's completely scalable. So the guidance runs from giving information about simple excavation and disposal options through to complex thermal treatment processes and everything in between, in situ and ex situ work. It also provides a lot of guidance as to how to develop remedial responses, and they can be, again, from very small to quite mammoth. And it gives some really good advice for scalable community consultation and engagement processes. So it's really designed for every size, but maybe Jyoti could say some more about that.
Sure, Ross. You're perfectly correct there. The NRF will cover all aspects of remediation and management of contaminated sites, and it is highly scalable. There are some very specific things it does not cover, which was ruled out, and perhaps it's worth going over them quickly. So it does not address unexplored ordnance, radioactive substances, biologically pathogenic materials and waste, contaminated sediments, and abandoned mining sites. Now, this is not to say that it cannot cover those things. It wasn't designed specifically to, but in some cases it may be applicable. We know that Western Australia, for example, does apply remediation guidelines to mining sites. And for these things for which there are limitations, we encourage users to talk to the appropriate government agency if proceeding with these. The NRF was also not designed to cover specific contaminants like PFAS, for example, and there are additional resources available in a different section of the NRF website called NRF Tools. There is a range of technical reports in there and guidelines which users can refer to, and there would be others, I guess, available from government agencies.
Thanks, Geordie. Good for that clarification, was very, very useful. Thank you. Moving on to another question now. Will the NRF take precedence over local jurisdictions' requirements? For instance, there is no audit system in Tasmania. Anybody would like to tackle that one?
It's Bruce here, Paul.
Yep.
Look, we made it very clear from the very beginning that in no way would the NRF override the prerogatives of state governments. So if the state government has a particular view on ways of doing a particular job, then that will prevail in that state. We were given that the NRF has no legal status, it's really guidance. I think we were very, very clear about that from the get-go. Jurisdictions would maintain their prerogatives when it came to decision making.
Thanks, Bruce. Anybody else want to make an observation about that issue? No? Okay, let's move on to the next question. Does the NRF represent more rigorous standards than the status quo? Will practitioners have to be more rigorous in their approach, or is this largely formalising existing practice? Bruce, maybe that one's sort of related to the last one a little bit.
Yeah, I think at this stage, Paul, it's formalising existing practice. We've built the NRF on existing practice, but recognising, of course, that things will move on. So we don't see the NRF as being a static beast. As standards, change, as practices change, as technologies change, then we expect as been discussed before, we expect the NRF to be updated accordingly. At the end of the day, it's guidance we're concerned.
Thanks, Bruce. Any other panelists wish to make an observation or comment on that question? Okay, let's move to the next one, which is probably one for Cheryl. Will the heads of EPA look to reference the NRF in future legislation iterations?
Thanks, Paul. Of course, heads of EPA is an informal body linking all of the jurisdictions themselves. So the HEPA itself doesn't have legislation, the individual states do. And as Bruce has said, individual states, this is not meant to override individual states. Nevertheless, my long experience with regulators is that they looking to pick up material such as this, well-referenced, well-researched, published material is a starting point for when we look at legislative change. So I can't say that heads of EPA will do it, but I can also say that individual states will value this. I think Adam, though, would like to respond to this question.
Sure. Adam.
He's still on mute.
Adam, would you like to make any comment on that question or from your perspective? Okay.
I'm here. Apologies, I was moderating. Which was the question, Paul?
It was will the heads of EPA look to reference the NRF in future legislation iterations? Says that you'd like to answer that question live.
I suspect that's probably not my jurisdiction as the communication manager. I might defer to perhaps Jyoti on that, but
Yeah, we've had a pretty comprehensive answer from Cheryl, but unless somebody wants to make another observation, that'd be fine. Joy, did you want to say anything?
Oh, look, perhaps just to say, in a similar way that NEPM has been referenced, or parts of it is sometimes referred to in national legislation, I believe that South Australia's GAR legislation actually does refer to the NRF in it, for example, already.
Oh, okay. Thank you for that. That's a useful thing to hear. All right, here's another good question. How does the NRF link or consider the PFAS NEP?
It's Bruce here, Paul.
Sure.
Doesn't, as Jody indicated, I mean, the NRF is not contaminant specific. It doesn't get into the management of any particular contaminant, so it doesn't actually reference the NEP. On the other hand, the principles and guidance within the NRF apply across the board to a whole range of sites and a whole range of contaminants. And I think when a consultant, in order to come across a particular type of contaminant, then, you know, part of their professional role is to be able to apply relevant guidance to that situation, whether that guidance is coming from the NRF or whether it's coming from the PFAS NEP in the case of PFAS.
Thanks, Bruce. Any other comment on that question from any other panelists? No? Okay, let's go to the next question. It's another good one. It's indicated that the NRF is aimed at complementing the NEPM, or the ASC NEPM. Is there any future endeavour or projections for it to eventually form similar environmental legislative obligations? I.e., I think the question is there any view that this, you know, in the future this might become a NEPM for remediation to complement the assessment one? Perhaps Cheryl, you might like to have a view about that.
Look, it's a possibility. Whether its utility is as it is now as a framework, as opposed to a NEPM, which I think are much more difficult to amend. I do think we need to be quite flexible around, you know, so I think from memory there are 13 technology guides. Technology changes very, very quickly. And so NEPMs do not change very quickly. So I think the utility is to keep it in a framework, to be honest, keep it updated.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Cheryl. Bruce, did you have any observation about that question at all?
Yes, I do. Having run the NEPC for quite a few years, I think it's fair to say, as Cheryl said, that NEPMs are first of all legal instruments, and being legal instruments are very difficult to amend. The NRF not being a legal instrument and having the modular construction, and given the fact, as Cheryl said, is that, you know, technology moves on, regulation moves on, and so on, that there will be a need for regular update and review of the NRF. And given its modular structure, you don't have to tackle the whole NRF at any one time. You can go to the relevant parts of the NRF, and might only be one module at a time, for example, and update it as needs. So I think the fact that it's not a legal instrument actually has significant advantages in terms of keeping it current.
Yeah, no, I think I would concur with both those observations. It took a long time. I think someone, Ross, you mentioned 14 years. You know, yeah. Some of us don't have any hair left after all that time. So yeah, there you go. So it's a long time to get NEPMs up, and they are.
Oh yeah, NEPMs. Yeah.
So I think that the view that Cheryl and Bruce espouse is something that I think the heads of EPA will probably, you know, and we did talk about this, I think, at the beginning of this process. Is it legislative change we want, or is it a change to inform policy and the environmental management framework? So I think there was a view that if you want to do this legislatively, we're in for a long, long haul. with jurisdictions and different political systems in each jurisdiction. So I think generally, I think it was agreed. Let's go with this framework and adapt it and modify it over time as things change. And so I think that's I think it's pretty much a universal opinion across the heads of EPA, probably industry too, as long as they get the outcome that they want. I think that's important. Ross.
I just wanted to say too that when we put the guidance together, we tried to future-proof it as best as we could. So there are a lot of fundamental components in how you do something, how you do capping systems, how you do in situ bioremediation. The fundamentals are the same. So while the technology does update, and sometimes there's some radical innovation that comes together, the fundamental ability of these guidance documents remains quite solid. And so it's going to be a useful document, even if we can't get it updated regularly. It'll still have a lot of value.
Yep. Thanks, Ross. Thanks, Ross. There's a question from Emily in regards to implementing the NRF. Has there been a collective agreement nationally with auditors to adopt this framework to ensure the intent of the document being a constant approach nationally, so we can use this as a reference and auditors will agree? Do you want to think about that one, Ross? It's probably in your bailiwick to start with, I suspect.
It's the auditors follow the requirements of their jurisdiction, and the jurisdictions, as Cheryl mentioned, have through the HEPA have acknowledged that this guidance is best practice. So as a consequence, good auditors make sure that best practice is being applied to their sites. So if you kind of follow the logic, if auditors should be accepting this as a good benchmark and move on from there. There's all kinds of local jurisdictional issues that have to be addressed, of course, but really this is basically in force now. Auditors should be using it as a benchmark.
Thanks, Ross. Cheryl, did you want to make any other observations?
No, I fully agree with Ross. You know, that it does provide that benchmark, that starting point.
Yeah.
A new starting point.
Yeah. Thank you. Anything, Mark or Gavin, did you have any observations about what your expectations might be of auditors and what have you? Mark.
Paul, yes, look, we use both auditors and technical advisors, and anything that can achieve consistency for us in the delivery of projects is an advantage where we've got a large number of sites we're trying to deal with. So it's the relative guidance we can give a whole lot of people doing work for us on the ground is great, and if the auditors can apply that as that standard, then that's really what we're looking for out of the process too.
Sure. Thanks, Mark. Gavin, did you want to make any other observation?
Probably the only other one is if you've got multiple sites or you're working across jurisdictions or assets, it's often a case of where do you spend your buck? You know, like where it's a risk discussion, and making sure that you get value for the effort you put in. So it's how do you use those sort of frameworks, but having something common across jurisdictions helps that. In those circumstances, as opposed to just having a particular interest in a single jurisdiction. Obviously we'd all like to fix everything now, but in reality, that's generally not what's possible.
Thanks, Gav. Let me move to the next question now from Ian. Is there an ability for the NRF to create a register of remediation projects and case studies that have been delivered using the NRF principles? Good question. Anybody like to have a stab at that at all? So this is really about the future and the maintenance of this asset. Again, goes to the heart of that question. Cheryl or Ravi?
Look, I think the I think this would require an organisation like CRC to create such a register. Individual states have various legislative responsibilities, but not necessarily a register of what frameworks were used to clean up the sites. And so depending on who picks up the maintenance for this product, it may be that a register could be maintained of what would be used from that. You know, I think the concept of a community of practice around the framework itself would work very well in the future, and that may generate then, you know, that sort of case study outcomes.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Cheryl. Ravi, did you want to make any comments?
Yes, Chairman, that's a really good question, and something that a number of people have asked CRCK as well, including some politicians. As I said, CRC is that independent body that could come up with such a register. But of course, it's quite a task to do that, because that requires close partnership collaboration with the owners who are getting the sites remediated, with the regulators, for them to open up and say, here's something which is being done, plus consultants as well. So this is something which is also included in the next version of CRC going forward, largely because there was some politicians who had asked that question. So hopefully if we do have next iteration of CRC in some form, we are able to do that, because it's quite an expensive process as well.
Yeah. Thanks, Ravi. Sorry, Ross, yes.
The guidance documents, and Jyoti will tell you, the guidance documents have case studies built into them. So if the question is sharing knowledge about how the guidance is being applied, the guidance documents actually have those case studies in them at the moment. And broader, I don't know whether there's much value really in having a register per se. I think there's greater value in industry associations like ALGA and ACLCA taking the guidance document and then using it and then talking about it at the various conferences about how it's being applied. I think that would be a much more effective mechanism than having a register that, you know, like it's hard to maintain, it's expensive to develop, and I don't think it would necessarily get to the real goal. So I'd be recommending that it just be picked up by industry instead. And
spoken about at conferences, etc., and what have you. Yeah, okay.
I think,
yeah, Ravi.
Just looking at how they're doing it in USA, there's I was provided with the report some time ago by ITRC, which is Interstate Technology Research Collaboration, where they had done just that, looked at the approaches to assessment and remediation of contaminated sites, what worked, what didn't work, why it didn't work, and then what happened to the site that was remediated, jobs created, for instance, and the value of the property. So register is not something which, it's just like a deaths and births register, for example, it keeps growing. And so with this one as well, NRF, for example, where it is applied, it's not a register that you do today and put it and shelve it, but this will keep growing. And this is something which is going to help not just practitioners, but also owners of contaminated sites as well. And that's the reason why we're looking at how we could create something like this, if we could. And then that it's not a dead body, it is live, and we keep updating that, just like NRF, as we said.
Thanks, Ravi. Let's move to the next question, which is how can someone add a new document to the toolbox in the future? Bruce, did you want to try kicking off an answer to that one?
Well, yeah, I mean, it won't be for me to implement, but the kind of thing we had in mind when we were talking to the steering group last year was that there'd be some kind of, assuming CRC Care kept on and was able to pick up the mechanisms for update, etc., was to develop some kind of committee, which might be a smaller version of the steering group we've had to date, which actually pick up all these suggestions for feedback that comes through the website, that would plan and execute any reviews of the NRF, and also pick up the issues that you've just referred to. So you could have a committee reporting to whether it's CRC Care or HEPA or whatever, that would pick up on those issues and make recommendations on an ongoing basis.
Thanks, Bruce. Any other panelists wish to make a comment about that addition of new documents? I guess it also goes to the heart of whether new technologies, etc. We talked a bit about before. We need to have a process for maintenance and improvement of this over time. I think it goes, again, a lot of these questions are aimed at what's going to happen in the future to make sure we don't lose the value of this asset over time. We've got a question here, which is an interesting one about, could you talk a bit about timeframes for remediation, including intergenerational equity, which we know is around about the 30-year timeframe, and has the NRF provided guidance on determining what is acceptable in terms of intergenerational equity? Tricky question. Ross, do you have any insights into that issue?
It certainly is covered, but not at depth in the institutional controls part of the document. The institutional controls guidance includes the concept of intergenerational equity and sustainability, and the cost benefits sustainability analysis tool includes the concept of moving costs into the future, and so that intergenerational equity comes there as well, net present value type of studies. And also it's embedded in the long-term management guidance document. So it is a fundamental idea, concept inside those documents, but it hasn't been drawn out specifically. It's probably worth a future consideration to add something else to it that just specifically talks about that sort of issue.
Thanks, Ross. Any other comment, Julie?
Can I just add also, I think another strong contribution of the NRF is the importance of stakeholder engagement. So if discussing intergenerational equity or timeframes for projects, it's important to bring in the key stakeholders. In addition to that, we find that things will depend on the site, the contaminants, and who the receptors are. And off-site receptors is another key thing, determining factor in this. If there is off-site effects, usually the appetite for timeframes in the project is much less.
Thank you. Thank you for that comment and that question. Good one. And we've got a question here from Fayod on, to what extent does the NRF coordinate or is in line with the SIRF, the International Sustainable Remediation, and the ISO International Standard on Site Remediation? Bruce, do you have any comment on that?
Perhaps I can say something there. The cost benefit and sustainability analysis guideline has two parts: cost benefit on the one hand and sustainability analysis on the other. And that particular tool, especially when it comes to the sustainability analysis, is incredibly flexible in terms of the kind of inputs that can be made into it. And it actually takes on board quite a few of the SIRF/ISO type indicators. It doesn't necessarily ask people to apply them in the same manner as, say, SIRF suggested initially, but you know, so there is that connection there, and you know, I mean, So if you're applying the CBSA guideline, you would be basically be compatible with the ISO standard, which is based on a lot of the original surf work. So there is a connection there, albeit informal. Should the ISO standard be updated sometime in the future, then I think it would be politic to look at the CBSA guideline as well. I might say too that the CBSA guideline, and I should have mentioned this before when the question came up, that has been used by, because it's been out in the public arena for quite a while, has been used by various companies who've found it very useful in terms of deciding whether or not to clean up, or secondly, to choose between different technologies or to choose between different end land users. So it's been a very flexible tool, and I think it's very much to the benefit of the users of NRF that that particular guideline is there.
Thanks, Bruce. We've got time for one more question. Luckily, we only have one left, according to my screen. But current guidance, the question from Gilbert, current guidance is a good step in developing a consistent framework. Is there a plan to provide minimum content expectations for a qualitative and quantitative ROA processes documentation to provide consistency in content, and for quantitative ROA will tie in with national cost estimation requirements and standards to provide clients with greater cost certainty? I might push this one to Ross initially, and perhaps Ravi or Mark or some other practitioners. Ross, did you want to kick off?
Thank you, Kenneth Gilbert, for your question. I recognise that complexity of the question. The remedial options assessment tool already has both qualitative and some quantitative components to it. So maybe have a look at that, and we can have a chat later on about it, perhaps. I think to some extent it's already been addressed by the guidance document, but Ken and I can have a chat about it offline, as he's just written to me as well.
There's the offer for an offline chat. Any other panelists wish to make an observation about the minimum content for ROA? No? Okay. Well, thank you very much. That was a really informative bunch of questions from you all. They're very much appreciated. Hope you've got a lot of value out of the webinar, and I'm going to hand back to Ravi Naidu to make some closing remarks before we finish up. So thank you very much and take care. Ravi, over to you.
Thank you very much, Paul, and also appreciate all the participants who are still there with the launch and for the question and answer session. What I would like to do is, particularly for those of us who are present who are not familiar with what CRCs are, I just want to step back a little bit, take you through what CRCs are, and then comment on the National Remediation Framework as part of my closing remarks. And once I finish that, then I would like to invite Prashant. He wants to say a few words about our webinar. Now, those of us who are not familiar with what CRCs are, CRCs are cooperative research centers. The very first word cooperative requires researchers, end users, in this case private industries and government departments, to be able to collaborate, work together, and particularly work towards coming up with a solution for problems that are constraining their business, be it private companies or government departments. And this was something that was introduced in the early 1990s. And at that time, the collaboration was largely between research provider organizations. And as time progressed, the Commonwealth of Australia decided that collaboration should go beyond just researchers and include end users as well. So we moved from public good outcomes to one where we had industry partners and government departments who also came together with researchers with issues that was constraining them. So these CRCs then cooperative research centers became what we call end-user-led centers of excellence that was required to address priority research issues. And if you address that, that benefited the company and at the same time benefited the nation as well. And CRC Care was first established in 2005 with initial leadership provided by the late Dr. Brian Robinson, who was chair and chief executive of EPA Victoria. And it was absolutely great seeing him, how he was able to help me bring together industry and also regulatory bodies. Now, one of the first major deliverables for the first phase of CRC Care was to develop health screening levels for petroleum hydrocarbons. And this was something which was constraining petroleum industries, and they had come to CRC Care as a member, as a partner, to see how we could then work with the regulators, take into consideration what the regulators wanted, and jointly work with them to come up with health screening levels, which later became NEPM, and therefore was part of NEPM, which still is. In addition to that, first phase of CRC Care, CRC also delivered standard operating procedures for bioavailability, being the only country globally to have bioavailability standard operating procedure as part of NEPM. No other country has that, because I do know quite a number of regulators have been asking us how we managed to do that. And the credit purely goes to regulators for them to ask the questions, be able to work together with the end users, and for us then to come up with which satisfied both the regulators and the industry as well. Along with those guidance policy work that we did, we also developed a number of technologies and published quite a number of science journal papers as well. Then came the next phase of CRC Care, which was starting from 2011 to 2020, one of the few CRCs to have had extension for nearly 9 years. And here, one of the key deliverables was National Remediation Framework. And I vividly remember when we were trying to pull together our bid document, there were so many issues that came up with a whole lot of things, and ultimately they all agreed that the way forward would be National Remediation Framework. A challenge meant innovation, and innovation meant opportunity that brought together regulators, small and medium enterprises, and major companies as well. A 10-year project, and that was not cheap. It was costing us money, but then we have absolutely outstanding leadership in Dr. Bruce Kennedy as the leader of the program. And the reason why we got Bruce was because of the experience that he had from being the executive director of National Environment Protection Corporation, and of course, our own chair and director, Dr. Paul Vogel, who brought in the regulatory aspects as well. And in addition to that, CRC Care has delivered 200 PhDs. No other CRC has done that, trained 4,000 environmental managers, and published more than 1,500 journal publications. Now, turning to National Remediation Framework, we took into consideration because the end users as well as the regulators, they recognized that different states and territories in Australia, they had different legislation where remediation was concerned. And therefore the key was to see how we could bring everybody together such that we had a framework that was a harmonized approach to site remediation and management across Australian jurisdiction, a framework that provided a structure for thinking through remedial strategies, a framework for a rigorous approach for considering issues with reduced risk for adoption of poor strategic issues, a framework that allowed for the systemization of practices being applied to many sites, a framework for a sustainable approach to remediation and management, and a framework that had seamless linkages with the NEPM. And if you reflect on the presentations today, for example, Ross McFarlane also mentioned a seamless transition from NEPM into National Remediation Framework. And if you recall presentations from Gavin Price and also Mark Berman, defense and companies like BHP, they are spread across Australia. And they're not in one state, they're in many states. And therefore, NRF provides that seamless approach to us to managing contaminated sites. So in summary, the National Remediation Framework is a seamless transition from assessment of site contamination, and it provides a comprehensive package of nationally harmonized guidance, both for assessment, remediation, and management of site contamination. There remains that question, how do we take this forward now that it is launched? Every effort is being made now under Mark Berman's chairmanship to see how CRC care could continue in a form, but also we understand from Cheryl and Paul Vogel, both of whom are part of heads of EPA, that this is something that heads of EPA will take into consideration as well. So with that, Paul, my closing remarks, and I was absolutely delighted that we had 400 registrants and more than 230 who really linked in. And I'm going to stop there and then leave it to you and also Prashant for Prashant's vote of thanks.
Thank you so much, Ravi. I won't be too long, audience. Thank you so much for joining this webinar today. You will receive a short survey that will be emailed to you shortly. Please take a moment to share your thoughts. We always appreciate your feedback. We will send you the link to today's recording when it's available in the next few days. Our next free webinar is going to be on LNAPL natural source zone depletion. And the details will be available on our website very soon. And finally, on behalf of our speakers and all of us at CRC Care, thank you once again for joining us and taking the time to view this virtual presentation. Thank you and have a nice day. Bye for now.